Season 3 of the Missing Witches podcast is brought to you by Foxglove Farm. Use offer code MISSINGWITCHES at checkout.
One of the questions that we ask a lot here at the Missing Witches podcast is, what is a witch? Certainly not all of the witches we profiled on the podcast would have called themselves a witch. Even today, amid the millions of hashtag witches of Instagram, calling yourself witch IRL is often met with condescension, a dismissive eye roll, a smug chuckle. This chuckle is, of course, preferable to not just historical, but contemporary witch hunt reactions of, being killed. All this to say, the stigma is still real. There are myriad reasons why a witch might not want to loudly classify themselves, so sometimes we have to go looking for clues to find the witches without visible cauldrons, goddess idols, or tarot decks. Sometimes we have to follow the breadcrumbs left behind for us to trace. I discovered Faith Ringgold while doing research for our Zora Neale Hurston episode. Now, Zora has been known to send messages to her admirers, so when I straight up gasped as for the first time I saw Faith Ringgold's absolutely visceral illustrations for Zora's book, The Three Witches, I knew I had to dig a little deeper. Turns out, one of Faith's most acclaimed works is a series she called Witch Masks. One of her most famous stories is about a little girl who can fly. As far as I know, Faith has never publicly called herself a witch. After all, as her mother reminded her constantly, she is from a good Christian home. But this recurring symbolic equation of freedom with flying through the night sky, these witch drawings and witch masks, coupled with her sigil work and alchemy, subverting traditional symbols and forms, reclaiming and politicizing so-called feminine arts, plus her work as a civil rights and feminist activist, author, educator, and all-around magical badass, and I think you'll agree, the witch is strong in this one. The Tate Modern called her a rule breaker and a game changer. She said, "I was absolutely taught by my family as a tradition that nobody can tell you what you can't do."
You aren't being a proper woman, therefore you must be a witch. You must be a witch.
Faith Ringgold is an expert weaver, not just in the textile sense, although she is a masterful textile artist, but also in the way she has managed to stitch together every aspect of her life and self into the expression of her work. Every new skill is carried over to her next medium. Every lesson she's learned, she has woven into her creations or taken the lemons and made sweet, sweet lemonade, Beyoncé style. Okay, I've said Beyoncé, so here's a quick aside for the Hive. Check out Faith's quilt, Dancing at the Louvre, then go watch the Carter's Apeshit video. The connection is obvious at first sight, so I was thrilled to read that the video was inspired, that Queen Bee herself was inspired by Faith Ringgold's work. Amid all her dualities, there's no infighting. Faith presents seamless. A tapestry, both literal and figurative, where every tiny thread disappears, so a single image can emerge. In his book, Faith Ringgold, A View from the Studio, Curly Raven Holton writes, "In my experience, the work of an artist is always closely aligned with the life of the artist. In Faith's case, her work bears testimony to her fight to achieve acceptance and recognition in a world that is both racist and sexist. She is to the stuffy boundaries of the art world what a civil rights advocate is to injustice. She is an Earth Mother figure, nurturing everyone's children, as well as a daughter, carrying on a proud tradition of multiple accomplishments instilled in her by her own determined mother. The Faith I have come to know is subtle and subversive in her art making. Her messages can shout or be subliminal at her choosing. She has been called a feminist, but she is quick to remind us that the feminist movement did not naturally seek out faces that looked like hers. Rather, she, with the force of her presence, pushed the movement and claimed inclusion. She is angry, and yet she is not consumed by anger." Now this is what I aspire to as a person and as a witch. To be not just a human dog pack of dualities and contradictions, snarling and snapping for attention and to be fed. And not the cliched more than the sum of my parts, but just like one complete person. To have emotions, but not be consumed by them, and rather to use those emotions as fuel to pursue a greater good. That's what I want for me and for all you missing witches out there casting spells with just your magical being of magical you. Fully you. I was talking to a witch friend and the subject of balance came up, her desire to balance all aspects of herself and her life. Balance. It's all about balance. And I was researching this episode at the time, so I stopped her. I'm tired of trying to balance, I said. My goal now is total integration, I said. I want to stop distributing and redistributing pieces of myself on a scale to be weighed and compared like Scrooge's coins or some cuts of meat at a butcher shop. I want to be a shining light of wholeness and authenticity who has left the stress of identity plate spinning behind. And my role model for this totally valid utopian pipe dream of capital B being will be Faith Ringgold. Faith was born in Harlem, New York in 1930, surrounded by the icons of the Harlem Renaissance. For those of you who missed our Zora episode, the Harlem Renaissance was a jazz-age black pride movement, a staking of artistic and cultural claim to the labels African and American. And indeed, Faith carried on with Zora's work in a very real and tangible way, calling her own work a, quote, pursuit of a more affirmative black aesthetic, which is something that Zora could easily have said herself about her own work. Faith says she felt no oppression in childhood because her community shielded her from the harsh reality of race in America. Her mother, delightfully named Willie Posey Jones, was a fashion designer, so their collaborations began early and lasted right up until Posey died in 1981. Faith was also, in a way, shielded by her illness. In the preface to her memoir, We Flew Over the Bridge, Faith wrote, "My life as an artist began as a child during the many hours I spent bedridden with asthma, picturing my small world and the people in it. By the time I became a teenager, I had started using my art to tell my story. When images alone were not enough, I added words to my pictures and later quilted them." But her asthma also kind of changed her life for the better. She couldn't go to school, but she wasn't always sick, so she spent a lot of her days accompanying her mother on errands and adventures. While other children were learning their ABCs, Faith was learning how to live. Now, here's the part where I'm so glad we live in a time where you can Google, I can link you to Instagram and show notes because you have to see Faith Ringgold's art. Description is difficult because words are insufficient. But in case you are listening, visually impaired, I shall try. Her quilts are colorful, narrative, floral granny squares of outgrown Sunday dresses border figures in living rooms and cityscapes, crafted from shapes and strips of textile and texture and paint. The materials are comforting and the subjects are both personal and political. It's almost as if Faith wanted to create a comforter, a visual safe space to lure us into her dissidence, her uncomfortable truths about race, sex, and class. Faith wrote that she made the move to needle and thread when images were not enough, but she has also said that she switched from painting to fabric to get away from the association of painting with Western European traditions. In a world before social media, she made a quilt to call out Picasso's legacy and hung it on a gallery wall. But we'll get to Picasso later. In 1950, at age 20, having already been an artist her entire life, Faith applied to art school, but because fine art was an exclusively male realm, she was forced to change her application to education, majoring in art. Faith did so knowing that no one can tell you what you can't do. She married a jazz musician and drug addict, and because of her courage and determination, she and her 2 daughters left him before he died of an overdose. Her daughters didn't understand why they had been kept away from their father and resented her. She did remarry eventually, but as we've seen with so many of our missing witches, her one true soulmate was her magic, her art. In the early 60s, Faith was painting timid landscapes and tepid still lifes, a trend at the time likely to fill the new demand for suburban decor. It was a style in line with a gallery she approached about a show. Perplexingly, the gallerist replied, "You can't do that." But leave it to Faith to lemonade those lemons. She said, "You know something? I think what she's saying is, it's the 1960s. All hell is breaking loose all over and you're painting flowers and leaves? You can't do that. Your job is to tell your story. Your story has to come out of your life, your environment, who you are, where you're from." I realized I can't tell your story. I can only tell mine. I can't be you. I can only be me. Now, Faith admits that that's probably not what the gallerist meant, but that's how Faith took it. Magical badass that she is. In an interview you can watch on YouTube, we'll link you in the show notes, she said, "I became an artist because I wanted to tell my story as a Black woman in America." So Faith sees telling her story and exercising her freedom to be a tribute paid to her ancestors and to the people who fought the struggle before her. And she is relentless. That gallery moment was a watershed for Faith, and she began the process of becoming the fully formed and developed whole person and artist she is today. Radical, bold, and audacious. Because a gallerist told Faith, "You can't do that." Catherine McMahon wrote, "The encounter was transformative. Over the next few years, Ringgold would produce some of the most searing depictions ever made of race relations in America, beginning with her, quote, American People series of paintings, which presents interracial tensions with unflinching clarity. In the American People series number 2, Between Friends, 1963, a white woman and a Black woman eye each other, close up, but from a vast psychological distance. In the American People series number 1, Members Only, 6 menacing white faces cloaked in shadows stare down the viewer." Art history professor Moira Roth was the editor of Faith's memoir. In her foreword, she wrote, "A few years ago, I wrote an article entitled A Trojan Horse, in which I praised Ringgold as a terrific and successful troublemaker during the 1960s, contrasting this time to her later, more covert actions as a troublemaker. Ringgold has always taken great delight in this description of her smuggling subversive material into the citadel of the art world in seemingly benign forms. But whether one thinks of Ringgold as the young firebrand of the 1960s or the distinguished, world-famous older artist of the 1990s, there are constants. Her boldness and originality as an artist and human being, her fiery independence, remarkable pragmatic savvy, and strategizing abilities, and her steadfast, passionate political and feminist goals. She is also inveterately inventive. Inventive, subversive, troublemaker. If you ask me, these are the markings of a witch. In 1967, a year of widespread race riots in America, Faith painted a stunning 12-foot-long visual bombshell called American People Series number 20, Die, in which both Black and white Americans appear, armed with guns and knives, bloodied, at war. But no one looks angry. Everyone looks sad or scared, desperate. 2 children, a little white boy and a little black girl, hug each other tightly and tenderly in their shared terror. In 1968, when the Whitney Museum organized a show about 1930s American sculpture that included not a single Black artist, Faith mobilized, organized, and demonstrated against this exclusion of Black artists. Here again we see the weaving that characterizes so much of Faith's life. She was Black, woman, artist, activist, teacher, all of these aspects manifesting as one, in one movement, in one moment. Years later, she wrote honestly, if cynically, in her summation, saying, "All the men got something. A show, a sale, a grant for a community project. I got nothing. But that did not surprise me, and today, some 25 years later, nothing much has changed at the Modern except which white man gets the next show." Of course, when Faith was writing her memoir back in the 80s, she couldn't have known that she would change the world. that she would have a school named after her, win countless awards, meet the president, a black president, be counted among the greatest American artists of the 20th century. Throughout the 70s, she just went on with her daily business of heroism. She founded the Ad Hoc Women's Art Committee, co-founded Women's Studies and Artists for Black Art Liberation, the National Black Feminist Organization, and Where We At, a group for Black women artists. She painted a mural for the Women's House as a permanent installation at the Women's House of Detention on Rikers Island. As a result, Art Without Walls, an organization that brings art to prison populations, was founded. And that's honestly just a small sample of Faith's initiatives in the 70s. Magical badass. We are trying as hard as we can to keep Missing Witches free and accessible for everyone. So please check out our sponsor, Foxglove Farm, where you can subscribe to wonderful monthly gift boxes, or you can get teas, handmade soap.
Oh my gosh, teas with specific healing love worked into them. This witch in her kitchen is combining herbs with a lot of knowledge and a lot of care and a lot of ethical practices that make us feel really comfortable recommending them.
It's cruelty-free. She gets her herbs and everything that she uses from the most ethical source she can find.
Yeah, it's palm oil free.
Mm-hmm.
Palm oil depresses the fuck out of me. I was so happy she said that.
Yes.
I love orangutans.
Yes. So again, I mean, we're so grateful and so lucky to be partnered with Foxglove Farm. Please go to foxglovefarm.com and use offer code Missing Witches for a super witchy 13% discount. As witches, we encounter a lot of iconography. We know that symbols have power. Some we use to concentrate our own intentions, but we also know that other symbols must be deconstructed, must have their power examined, and, if necessary, subverted. And Faith is no exception here. Some of her most acidic work is based on those 50 pentagrams and 13 wands, old stars and stripes, the American flag. It's a symbol of both freedom in one hand and oppression on the other. From culturetype.com. In 1970, she helped organize the People's Flag Show in Manhattan. The exhibition was mounted as a protest against laws that restricted the use and display of the American flag. The show opened on a Monday, and that Friday, November 13th, Ringgold and two other artists, John Hendricks and Jean Tucci, were arrested. The U.S. Attorney General's office charged the Judson Three, as they became known, with desecration of the flag and shut down the exhibition. Lawyers from the American Civil Liberties Union provided them with counsel, and all of the charges were subsequently dropped. The 60s was rough, Ringgold said. Most artists were not paying attention. They were painting beautiful paintings abstractly, but they were not telling the story of what was going on in America, and I thought I wanted to be that person. For that, I paid a terrific price. It was hard. They put me out and tried to keep me out, but I persisted. Faith's work with the American flag is shocking and incendiary, even by today's standards. Like America itself, these paintings show themselves to be one thing, but on closer inspection, reveal themselves to be something else. In We Flew Over the Bridge, Faith wrote, I found my artistic identity and my personal vision in the 60s by looking at African masks, and my art form through the serial paintings of Jacob Lawrence, the powerful geometry of African masks and sculpture that informed modern art is what I like best about Picasso, Matisse, and the other modern European masters I was taught to copy. It is their exquisite compositions of shape, form, color, and texture that make Picasso, Matisse, and Jacob Lawrence's work so wonderful. You've probably all seen and can picture that Picasso face. Hard-lined, deep-set, beautiful, and grotesque. But unless you've studied art history or you're doing research for a podcast on Faith Ringgold, you might not be aware that Cubism was directly inspired by African mask art. But now that I've said it, it seems so obvious, right? Picture a Picasso face. Now picture an African mask. The similarity is so clear once it's been pointed out, but whitewashing is brainwashing. That's what colonialism does. It takes the sacred and rebrands it until we all forget where it came from, mass produces and mass markets until all power and meaning is scrubbed out. The mighty divine, which is a portal of transformation and connection to the spirit world, is rendered object. Kitsch. Hung on a wall and stripped of its rightful place in the holy dance. Faith said, I researched African, my own art, the classical art form of Black people, on my own. I really taught myself because there were no courses being taught on African art and artists. I had to get my education, and then I had to get my re-education, which was what I gave myself. Picasso denied the influence of African art on his own paintings, despite the fact that he previously said he experienced a, quote, revelation while viewing African art at the Trocadero Ethnographic Museum in Paris. The expansion of the French Empire into sub-Saharan Africa meant that African artworks were being brought back to Paris museums for exotic displays. Media buzzed with stories of cannibalism and other gossipy tales of the African kingdom. The Dark Continent. In 1991, Faith made a fucking masterpiece quilt called Picasso's Studio, where a beautiful Black woman poses proudly at the center of the space, natural, powerful, surrounded by white women, faces abstracted in the style of Cubism. The figure of Picasso himself is pushed off to the left, to the past. He is blue, old, his canvas blank and empty. It's like Faith called out the entire art world and all of Western culture with a single quilt. It's phenomenal, and it shows that Faith can do it all at once, all the time. So conjure in your mind a Picasso painting. Now picture an African mask. Think about how many times something ancient and sacred has been stolen and put on display. Or whitewashed, repackaged, sold, and had its roots denied. Bell Hooks wrote, such appropriation happens again and again. It takes the form of constructing African American culture as though it exists only to suggest new aesthetic and political directions white folks might move in. So, witches, let's give back some stolen time and energy to the magic of African masks, whose mystical history is so vast and multifaceted that we can only break the ice here. But hey, this is the Missing Witches podcast, so let's scratch that surface, dive in, and see what lurks on below. Because mask making is one of the oldest art forms in the world. There are so many mask designs among African cultures, and so many materials used: wood, leather, bone, bronze, ceramics, ivory, straw. Each mask is one of a kind. Traditional masks used in ceremony are owned and passed on by families and clans who, from generation to generation, enlist the spirits to help and protect them, honoring the spirits and asking for their blessings. The designs are infinite, but the most common are animal representation and ancestor representation. Animal and ancestor masks connect people to the spirit world that traditional African beliefs say inhabit the land. Wearing the masks, the people are transformed, possessed. At other times, masks make the spirits visible to enable communication. Masks were a part of most, if not all, rituals, funeral ceremonies, initiation rites to ward off destruction, to bless soil. For example, the Nuna of Burkina Faso seek the help of powerful spirits who live in the wild forests, bush country, and rivers surrounding their villages. They create animal spirit masks depicting nature spirits of hawk, buffalo, and crocodile, all of which live near the village. For the Dogon of Mali, who are expert agriculturalists, the antelope is the symbol of the hardworking farmer. Dancers wearing the masks hit the ground with sticks to represent the pawing of an antelope and the hoeing motion of the Dogon farmers. A signature piece of Angolan mask art is the female mask, Winapo, worn by male dancers in their puberty rituals. This female ancestor mask is worn by boys turning into men as a symbol of power and fertility. There are masks to represent tranquility, used to portray the virtues of self-control and balance. Bulging foreheads carved with designs symbolize wisdom. Scowling, teeth-baring for war masks. Myths, histories, morals, and lessons are all bound up in these sacred objects, and they are essential to preserving oral tradition. Faith Ringgold began her witch mask series in 1973. She wrote, "The first ones had no bodies. Later, I added a width of cloth to make a dress. I embroidered the dress with raffia thread and hung 2 gold-painted gourds on it to suggest breasts. These were my witch mask series, and I made 11 of them. The very first one was woven with red, black, and green and gold beads, and I named it African Design Face Mask. The next in the series was called Women's Liberation Talking Mask. It too was woven with gold and multicolored beads. The others were called Weeping Woman and Kissing Witch, and there were several in each of the series. My first male mask, Male Face Mask number 1, was also a part of the Witch Mask series. These mask faces were made of a combination of macrame, applique fabrics, and sewn beads. The Weeping Woman masks had beads hung on cords for tears, and the Kissing Witch masks had puckered lips. All of these masks were hooded so that they could be worn, although a masked performance piece had not yet entered my mind. I must tell you that when I first conceived of these masks, I was reluctant to include costumes. I planned to show 2 of the masks along with 3 large slave rape tankas in my 10-year retrospective exhibition that year. This would represent a new direction my work would be taking in the future. But wouldn't it be too way out to have costumes on the masks? I decided to exclude the costumes for the exhibit and add them later. I had seen African masks adorned in wonderful costumes at the Museum of Natural History and other museums. From these exhibits and the books on African art I had read, I knew that the costume was an integral part of the mask. It made the mask a more complete spiritual and sculptural identity, and stressed the fact that masks are not just objects to hang on a wall, but are also to be worn. I wanted my masks to be just like that. So, Women's Liberation Talking Mask Witch Series number 1, for example, has a nose shaped like an arrow, pointing down toward the mouth, about which Lisa Farrington wrote, "For Ringgold, these stylistic devices manifest her concerns with issues of voice, particularly the chronically silenced voices of African American women." Back to Bell Hooks, who I was delighted to discover was herself inspired by Faith Ringgold. If you haven't heard of activist and philosopher Bell Hooks, Google her. You won't regret it. From Bell's 1992 book, Yearning, Chapter 12, Aesthetic Inheritances, History Worked by Hand. To write this piece, I've relied on fragments, bits and pieces of information found here and there. Sweet late-night calls to Mama to see if she remembers when. Memories of old conversations coming back again and again. Memories like reused fabric in a crazy quilt contained and kept for the right moment. I have gathered and remembered. I wanted one day to record and document so that I would not participate in further erasure of the aesthetic legacy and artistic contributions of Black women. This writing was inspired by the work of artist Faith Ringgold, who has always cherished and celebrated the artistic work of unknown and unheralded Black women. Evoking this legacy in her work, she calls us to remember, to celebrate, to give praise. Even though I have always longed to write about my grandmother's quilt making, I never found the words, the necessary language. At one time I dreamed of filming her quilting. She died. Nothing had been done to document the power and beauty of her work. Seeing Faith Ringgold's elaborate story quilts, which insist on naming, on documentation, on Black women telling our story, I found words. When art museums highlight the artistic achievement of American quilt makers, I mourn that my grandmother is not among those named and honored. Often representation at such shows suggests that white women were the only group truly dedicated to the art of quilt making. This is not so. Yet, quilts by Black women are portrayed as exceptions. Usually there is only one. The card identifying the maker reads, "Anonymous Black Woman." Art historians focusing on quilt making have just begun to document the traditions of Black female quilt makers, to name names, to state particulars. Bell continues, "Baba did not read or write. She worked with her hands. She never called herself an artist. It was not one of her words. Even if she had known it, there might have been nothing in the sound or meaning to interest, to claim her wild imagination. Instead, she would comment, 'I know beauty when I see it.' She was a dedicated quilt maker, gifted, skillful, playful in her art, making quilts for more than 70 years even after her hands got tired and her eyesight was quitting. It's hard to give up the work of a lifetime, and yet she stopped making quilts in the years before dying. Almost 90, she stopped quilting. Yet she continued to talk about her work with any interested listener. Fascinated by the work of her hands, I wanted to know more, and she was eager to teach and instruct, to show me how one comes to know beauty and give oneself over to it. To her, quilt making was a spiritual process where one learned surrender. It was a form of meditation where the self was let go. This was the way she had learned to approach quilt making from her mother. To her, it was an art of stillness and concentration, a work which renewed the spirit. Faith continued to stitch together her art, politics, and experience, and in 1991 wrote her children's book, Tar Beach, which weaves fantasy and reality with themes of race and class, and does so with whimsy and hopefulness. Based on a quilt she made in the mid-'80s, Tar Beach is about a little girl who can fly and takes ownership of all she surveys, including the Washington Bridge, an ice cream factory, and the Union Building where her father is not allowed to be a member. Of course, it's never explicitly mentioned that the main character, 8-year-old Cassie, is a witch, but in my reading, it's implied. The book itself is a tapestry of human experience, and Faith's illustrations illuminate her manuscript with an energy you can feel. The story begins like this. I will always remember when the stars fell down around me and lifted me up above the George Washington Bridge. And it ends like this. It's very easy. Anyone can fly. All you need is somewhere to go that you can't get to any other way. The next thing you know, you're flying among the stars. Faith Ringgold, the radical, provocative, incendiary political artist, has written 16 more children's books since Tar Beach. The Guggenheim purchased the Tar Beach quilt in 1988, but as far as I know, it's locked in a vault. Never yet placed for public viewing. In the Z Budapest episode, I wrote, healers and scientists can harness the power of natural poisons and turn them into medicines. It's a very witchy thing to do. We make medicine from poison, art out of grief, grab calm from inside a storm. And this lemonading is, again, I think, a large part of Faith's magic. She wrote, I borrowed the story of our ancestors when they were down and out and singing the blues. A beautiful art form came out from all of that misery and suffering, so I said, let me turn this into something beautiful. This doesn't have to be something ugly. This can be something beautiful. I can beautify this. I will beautify this. But Faith reminds us in her work, in her life, that obtaining freedom is not the same as maintaining freedom. We can make all the progressive laws we want, but the laws of man are not the laws of physics. They can change, be revoked, backslide, or be unjust from the jump. In the States, you have your Bill of Rights. In Canada, we have our Charter, and it certainly is magical thinking to believe that, so it is written, so it shall be done. But how we treat people is an entirely individual affair. Passing laws can help, but we can't mandate shifts in consciousness. Plus, certainly passing a law is one thing, enforcement is another. And what do we do when even ethical laws are used as ammunition for systemic racism? We know that laws are one thing, but justice is quite another. We can't count on laws to be just. Freedom is a delicate flower that requires daily nurturing. Faith is, of course, older now, but she continues to exercise her freedom at every turn. In her later years, she got a new house and wanted to add a studio on the back. Her racist neighbors complained when she applied for the permits, saying they didn't want those types of people coming and going. Faith could easily have moved to a more welcoming neighborhood, but she stayed and fought and built her studio. Curly Raven Holton wrote, as Faith told me her story, I asked her, when you look out your studio window, what do you see? I see my determination to be free in America. And I'd like to pass that on, because I know that a lot of people have had the problems I've had. And a lot of people have had to give up because they couldn't afford to persevere. You see, they couldn't afford to win. And freedom is not free. You've got to pay for that dream. If you ask me, Faith's work is and has always been spellcasting, an alchemy, transforming spaces, minds, matter, and emotion. She doesn't call this spellcasting, but I'll let you decide if these are the words of a witch making magic, she said. To make up for some of the closeness I missed with my daughters, I made a number of works of art. Through art, I tried to create the peace we could not achieve in real life. When her daughters began to fall in love, Faith made wedding installations in gallery spaces to contend with those motherly feelings of both profound joy and profound loss. When her own mother died, she made a quilt in just 2 days. In her home, she keeps an altar, though she calls it a shelf, with pictures of ancestors and a painting she did when she was 18 years old to remind herself of her growth. With a multidisciplinary joie de vivre, Faith Ringgold resolves the unresolvable. Self, other, future, past, love, death, history, equality, fantasy, reality, root, and bloom. This, again, I think, is her magic. And maybe even the truest magic. Total oneness in total freedom. Honesty. Authenticity. The youest possible you. The faithest possible faith. But if you're still not convinced that she, the illustrator of witches and creator of witch masks, transmogrifier of materials and minds, is herself a witch at heart, I'll leave you with a song Faith wrote, witchily titled, Anyone Can Fly. So grab your broomsticks, my missing witches, my witches found. You can beautify this. Be wholly yourself. Gather, remember, and fly. There is a place way up high where anyone can fly. There's no limit to where you can go or how strong your wings can grow. All you have to know, anyone can fly. If one can, anyone can. All you gotta do is try. Spread your arms to reach the sky, and you'll know the reason why. Anyone can fly. You may have to take a chance. Feel the joy of song and dance. Let your body move around. Learn to laugh instead of frown. Don't waste another day worrying about what people say. Take your life in your hands. Now contemplate the flight command. Anyone can fly. If one can, anyone can. All you gotta do is try. Spread your arms to reach the sky, and you'll know the reason why. Anyone can fly. They may say you don't know, you can't learn, and you can't grow, tell you that you're through and make it seem true, have you laying in the street without a home and nothing to eat. Get inside your head so strong, make you think everything right is wrong, but not for long. Anyone can fly. If one can, anyone can. All you gotta do is try. Spread your arms to reach the sky, and you'll know the reason why. Anyone can fly. There are some people with wings in the sky. They are low, but they fly high. They say you must have a certain face, be a certain kind of a certain race, and that you must come from a certain place. But they are guilty of telling a lie, that only certain folks can fly. Anyone can fly. If one can, anyone can. All you gotta do is try. Spread your arms to reach the sky, and you'll know the reason why. Anyone can fly. You must use the power of the flight command. You must learn the magic of the helping hand. Love yourself and others too. Believe in them and believe in you. And try hard at everything you do. Anyone can fly. If one can, anyone can. All you gotta do is try. Spread your arms to reach the sky, and you'll know the reason why. Anyone can fly.
You must be a witch.
Season 3 of the Missing Witches podcast is brought to you by Foxglove Farm. Use offer code MISSINGWITCHES at checkout.